Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Ultimate Exotics, once again returning to Gran Turismo 2 to take a look at another one of the exclusive exotics, really, supercars specifically, and this vehicle is one which I was meant to feature on Tuesday, but for whatever reason I didn't. I don't recall why that happened. I think I just totally forgot about doing the car on that day, but this vehicle is probably my least preferred of the three Vector models featured in Gran Turismo 2. In terms of numbers, it's pretty much the best of the three, but I have always preferred the M12. Now the M12 is a slightly newer car, it's a sleeker design, much more Lamborghini-esque in certain elements, and it got closer to being a success than this one ever did. Plus, of course, we have the racing version of the M12, which is a reasonably good race car. Not amazing, but reasonable. Certainly a good rival for stuff like the Elise GT1 or the Jaguar XJ220. Now, this vehicle is more the initial vision, from what I can remember, of the owner of the company, Gerald Wiegert, and this is named after him, the Wiegert Vector W8 Twin Turbo, which is quite a name for quite a car. The design is, as far as I would say, kind of a cross between elements of Lamborghini Countach and Lancia Stratos, somewhere in there, but at the same time it's very much its own thing. It has a relatively unique design, clearly inspired by other things, but at the same time not really exactly like anything else. But in particular, it's the sheer numbers of this car which are very impressive. It is far more expensive than the M12. The M12, which we will also feature down the line in this series, is under 200,000 credits, whereas this one is 420,000. That makes it one of the more expensive supercars in this series. Now, the engine in this car is a 6-litre, it's a turbocharged unit, mid-engine, rear-wheel drive, as you'd probably assume, and fully tuned you're looking at 714 horsepower and an equally impressive 684 pound-feet of torque. Now, in a car that only weighs 1,379 kilos after the full weight loss package has been applied, which incidentally means that pretty much all of its numbers are better than the M12, far more power, a huge amount more torque, and also less weight, funnily enough. The horsepower per tonne is not insane, but 518 is certainly a good level to be working with. That's almost Veyron territory. And the price, although high, seems to be quite a good one, given those numbers. It certainly makes it an interesting rival to stuff like the Ford GT90, or even the TVR Speed 12, if you wanted to take that on also. So the question, of course, is, given that this car isn't talked about that much in the Gran Turismo franchise, how good is it? Because it certainly doesn't get the same kind of favourable nostalgia that many others like the GT90 have. So does that mean it's a bad car, or is it just one that gets overlooked and forgotten? Well, to some degree, I would say it's more the latter, because it's not a bad car, actually. The handling is surprisingly good, in fact. It's very tail-happy, it's very slippery, of course, but at the same time, surprisingly forgiving, so much so that it kind of runs the fine line between being a good handling car and a bad handling car. You can very easily spin out in the vehicle or go off track, but at the same time, unlike many supercars which are just tail-happy and that's it, this one does have range. If you push it to its limit and push it in a way that controls that power, it can actually give you some pretty great lap times, far better ones than you might assume it could. This is far from being just a straight line machine, and even in real life there is a precedent for that to be the case, because when Clarkson drove the M12, the version that I prefer of the Vector range, he said that the best point about that car by far was actually the handling. And that comes from a guy who doesn't even like American cars. So the fact that this one is quite good around corners, better than you might assume, isn't necessarily too surprising, given that that seems to be, in real life at least, quite a good point about Vectors. They are actually pretty good handling supercars. Especially back then, in the early 90s in particular, supercars weren't exactly known for having good handling. The XJ220 was good enough, the EB110 was fairly heavy but not necessarily bad, the F40 stood out, and that's why it stood out so much, because the others weren't that great. and even stuff like the Porsche 959 isn't primarily remembered for its handling, but more so just for its technical ability and sheer acceleration. Then something like my favourite car, the Chazetta, certainly isn't known for its handling, which again is why vehicles like the F40 and the McLaren F1 stood out so much, because they were so far superior. Now this one doesn't get that same recognition because it's not necessarily quite that good, but it is a lot better than it easily could have been. So this is a car which, if you do get the chance to play Gran Turismo 2, is definitely one of the highlights that I would recommend checking out. In fact, I would recommend trying all three of them, because all three Vector models are similar, but at the same time, very different. They're similar in concept, in as much as they are all three top-level supercars of the early 90s, but at the same time, this one is a very futuristic, but at the same time in a very old-fashioned way, approach to a supercar. Almost what somebody, maybe from the 60s or 70s, thought a year 2000 supercar might look like. It has that kind of design to it, whereas the M12 is a much more 90s example of a supercar. It looks like a Diablo or like a Chazetta. It's got that kind of profile. So overall, although it's a very expensive car, and it's not necessarily a car that's going to win a huge amount of races, it is one that I'd recommend checking out if you can spare the cash. Even if you don't have enough money to fully tune it, it's still an interesting car to try out even in its stock form, because it's still very fast. In fact, it has one of the best top speeds in the game. But overall, that's it for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.